he had been declared of German blood by Hitler in 1939. Along with 3 other soldiers, 2 of whom were also Mischling, Bloch was instructed to find Josef Yetzet and bring him to safety. Wow. The Nazis, okay, dispatched their own soldiers to find this guy and bring him to America. And this is again during war. But how do you find this guy? Bloch and his colleagues had to maneuver through the ruins of Warsaw without arousing the suspicions of the SS to find a rabbi who did not know of their mission and did not want to be found. Okay, so this rabbi is hiding from everyone. So how do you find this guy? And he's deadly afraid of all German soldiers because he sees them as just Nazis. This is another problem. Well, Jews in the city were naturally unwilling to divulge the location of a Hasidic leader to a Nazi officer. Eventually, the information came from the Americans. Brandeis was informed of Josef Yevet's address by the Shabbat lawyer Arthur Rubinowitz and relayed it via Cohen and Pell to the U.S. chargé d'affaires in Germany. This requires the coordination of dozens and dozens of people who are supposed to be on the opposite side of a war. And they're working together to achieve a goal. At the end of November, Bloch found Josef Yevet's apartment and after some confusion convinced the residents he was there to help. Once he had obtained few coupons, train tickets, and military clearances for SS checkpoints, Bloch loaded Josef Yetzet and his family onto a truck and headed for the train station. There the family received first-class tickets and boarded a train filled with Nazi officials and soldiers. Okay, and that's how they got him out. In other words, they are able to work above the bureaucracy of different nation states in order to achieve their eschatological goal. Okay? All right. Does it make sense? All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the idea of eschatological convergence. Because once we know the different eschatologies and we know how they converge together, we can actually make certain predictions about how this war will progress. Okay, so the first major eschatology I want to look at is called Zoroastrianism. And this is the first eschatology, and it's an eschatology of the Persian Empire, okay? And this eschatology is very simple. In the world, there's truth and the lie, okay? The light and the darkness. And it is our responsibility as humans to live for the light, to die for the truth against the lie. And at the end of days, there will be a final battle and a day of judgment, okay? So light versus dark, and then you have a day of judgment. Okay, where the God, Ahura Mazda, will come down and he will create a paradise for everyone. Okay, so what matters is to live a noble life and await the day of judgment where eventually heaven on earth will manifest, okay? And this is important because if you think about how the Iranians are fighting this war, the Iranians refuse to take the initiative and destroy too much, okay? They refuse to be the villains in this war because for them, in their eschatology, it's important to die for the light, to fight for the truth, okay? Now, Zoroastrianism has a major impact on Jewish eschatology, okay? And Jewish eschatology, again, I'm only talking about the most extreme version of this eschatology, okay? And in this eschatology, the idea is that the Jews disobeyed God, okay? Disobedience. And in order to repair the world, to save themselves, to create heaven on earth, they need to engage in redemption, okay? Redemption. And redemption is really about spiritual alchemy, improving yourself as a person, being good to yourself, being good to others, loving your neighbor as though you would love yourself. Okay, that's a mainstream idea. But in the most extreme version, redemption just means acting out God's plan to compel the return of the Messiah, okay? And this plan is basically create Israel, return Jewish diaspora, build third temple, and this will often called the War of Gog and Magog. And then when the Jews are most threatened, the Messiah will come to save them from their enemies. And this will create something called the Messianic age, okay? When God rules over the earth through his Messiah, who comes from the house of David. Okay, all right. So again, this is a simple version. There are lots of different versions. This is the most simple version for our purposes, okay? Now, what's interesting is that this Jewish eschatology would go on to influence the Protestants, okay? And this creates a movement called Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism, so the technical word for Christian Zionism is called premillennial dispensationalism. Okay, and this sounds very complicated, but it's not. All it means is that God has a plan for how to create heaven on earth, and we have a duty to fulfill his plan by following his instructions. Okay? All right. So what Christian Zionism is doing is that it takes this Jewish eschatology and makes certain changes to it. Okay? So, for example, the first change that it makes is, okay, this plan is fine, but rather than say that the Jewish Messiah is the representative of God, what they say is that, no, he's actually the representative of Satan. Okay? So the Messiah, in the Jewish tradition, becomes the Antichrist in the Christian Zionist tradition. And why is this important? It's important because for the Christians, the Messiah must be Jesus. Okay? So the Messiah, so the Antichrist, what he does is that he rules over the world. He's very charismatic, and he rules the world in Jerusalem. And he starts the war of Gog and Magog in order to conquer the world and destroy the Jews. Now, at this point, Jesus will return to save God's chosen people, the Jews. And when Jesus returns, there'll be something called the rapture, where all Christians will immediately ascend to heaven. Okay? So the rapture. All right. Okay? So again, Christian Zionism is working off Jewish eschatology, but it's making some important changes. Okay? So another way of saying this is, in the beginning, Zionists and Christian Zionists will work together to reach a certain point of history, okay, what we call the Great Israel Project, but then they will diverge and fight against each other, okay? So they're allies now, but eventually they'll turn against each other. All right, so now I want to talk about the Freemasons. Because the Freemasons, we'll talk more about the Freemasons later, okay? The Freemasons are also working within the Christian Zionist context. But they are much more focused on actually how to implement this, okay? So what they want to do is they want to take the Antichrist and turn it into a system.